Content warning. This video contains graphic descriptions of violence, psychological terror, and deeply disturbing real-life accounts. It may be entirely unsuitable for viewers under 18 or those who are sensitive to fear-inducing content. If you are under 18 or if horror content affects your sleep, your sense of safety, or your mental well-being, please stop here. Do not watch. We mean it. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Let me tell you something about fear. Real fear, not the kind you feel at a haunted house. Not the kind you get watching a slasher film from your couch with a bowl of chips. But real fear, the biological kind, the kind that floods your body with chemicals your ancestors evolved specifically to keep you alive in moments like this one. Real fear doesn't feel like excitement. It feels like clarity. The world goes very sharp. Sound becomes specific. The hairs on your arms stop being decorative. Your body, without asking your permission, makes a decision about whether to fight, run, or go completely still. And it makes that decision faster than language can catch up. Faster than you can form a coherent thought. Faster than the part of your brain that likes explanations has a chance to explain anything. This is not a glitch. This is not your imagination running away with you. This is several million years of survival pressure encoded in your nervous system, running silently beneath your conscious experience of every single ordinary day. And on most days, you never notice it. Because on most days, nothing activates it. Nothing crosses the threshold. The machinery runs cold and quiet, and you go about your life. But sometimes something does cross it. And when it does, you have a very brief window in which to make a decision. Do you listen? Or do you reach for the comfortable story that explains it away? The three people whose stories I'm about to share all face that window. The moment where the body knew. Where instinct stopped being background noise and became the loudest thing in the room. What's remarkable, what keeps me up at night, honestly, is what each of them chose to do with it. One listened immediately. One almost didn't. One didn't at all and carried the consequences in his bones for the rest of his life. These are real accounts. The names are changed. Some of the specific locations have been slightly adjusted to protect privacy. But the events, every footstep in the dark, every piece of glass hidden in food, every body on a basement floor, those are exactly as they were told to me. I'm going to ask you to sit with this. Don't scroll past it. Don't let it play in the background while you do something else. Some stories deserve your full attention. This is one of them. You've been warned. The voice in the trees. The drive up. My parents don't tell this story to just anyone. In fact, in 28 years, I've heard it told in full exactly twice. Once when I was 15, and old enough my mother decided to know what had actually happened, and once when I was 22 and about to take my first camping trip with my then girlfriend. My mother told it that second time, standing in my kitchen very quietly, with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold while she talked. She always ends the story the same way. She sets down her mug and she looks at you and she says, "I want you to know that I still think about those tires." And then she doesn't say anything else for a while. And you understand that what she means is, someone did that while we were sleeping. And we didn't hear them. And we never knew how long they'd been there before we did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was the summer of 1988. My parents were young, 24 and 26, and newly married, and living in a small apartment in Portland with one window that faced a brick wall, and a landlord who was technically responsive to maintenance requests, but personally insufferable. They needed a vacation. They had very little money. My dad had 2 weeks of vacation time saved from his job at the loading dock, and my mom had just finished her first year of nursing school and was in the specific, exhausted, euphoric state that follows surviving something difficult. Someone at my dad's work mentioned a campground in northern Oregon, Crater Ridge, up in the Coast Range, not a state park, not an established campground with bathrooms and fire rings and families in matching North Face jackets, but a genuine backcountry spot. The kind of place that locals knew about and kept fairly quiet. Tall trees, a creek that ran cold even in August, ridge views that on clear days stretched all the way to the Pacific. My mom loved it immediately when she saw the photos. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly where we're going." They left on a Friday evening after my dad got off work at 4. There were stops for gas, for sandwiches made at a deli counter by a woman who called my dad Han and gave him extra pickles, for a bag of ice that turned out to be mostly water by the time they needed it. My dad's truck, a 1981 Chevy with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked intermittently, made a sound on steep uphills that my mother described as the truck asking us to reconsider our life choices. They took a wrong turn twice on the mountain roads and had to backtrack both times, navigating by a paper map folded and refolded until it was soft as cloth. By the time they found the pullout that the guy from work had described, it was pushing 10 o'clock, and the sky above the tree canopy was the specific deep blue that comes just before full dark. The stars were coming out. You could see them properly up there, away from the city light. The Milky Way actually visible as a smear of brightness across the darker dark. My dad backed the truck into the clearing. The headlights swept across tall pines and a fire ring of stacked river rocks and a log that had fallen at some point and been left in place, smoothed by years of other campers using it as a bench. Someone in a previous season had hung a rusted horseshoe from a branch near the fire ring, and it turned slowly in the slight air movement from the truck's arrival. It was a good spot. Quiet. Deeply, completely quiet, in the way that places without electricity and engines and other human beings are quiet. A quality of silence that city people encounter rarely, and that takes a few minutes to stop feeling like something is missing. Beautiful in the way that remote places are beautiful, with that particular sense of having come somewhere that doesn't particularly care, whether you're there or not. Somewhere that was the same before you arrived, and would be the same after you left, and held no memory of either. My dad started unloading their gear from the truck bed. My mom, tired from hours in the passenger seat, sat down on the fallen log and tipped her head back and looked at the stars coming out above the tree line. She said it was the most peaceful she'd felt in months, maybe the whole year. That was when she heard the footsteps, circling. She told me she almost dismissed it the first time. The forest makes sounds at night. Things move through it constantly. Deer, raccoons, opossums, foxes, the occasional bear moving through a corridor between feeding areas. An experienced outdoors person learns to categorize these sounds automatically. The light scatter of a small animal, the heavier, more deliberate tread of a deer, the particular crashing of something larger that isn't trying to be quiet, because it doesn't need to be. What she heard was none of those things. It was measured, patient, 2-footed, somewhere between 25 and 40 feet, out from the edge of the campsite, moving through the pine needles with the specific slowness of something that is not in a hurry. Not because it's cautious, because it knows it has time. She listened to 3 full circuits of the campsite before she stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't reach for anything. She walked across the campsite to where my father was pulling their cooler out of the truck bed, and she put her mouth very close to his ear, and she whispered, "There is someone walking around us in the dark, and they've been doing it for at least 2 minutes. She has said that my father's response, in a strange way, was one of the things that made her fall in love with him. He did not question her. He did not say, "Are you sure?" or "It's probably just a deer," or "You're tired from the drive." He straightened up, looked out at the tree line, and said one word: "Truck." They left everything where it was. The cooler, the tent, still folded in its bag, the sleeping bags, the camp stove, my mother's hiking boots that she'd set beside the log, my father's good hunting knife that he'd hung on a branch near the truck. They got in. My father backed out without turning on the lights, navigating the pull-out by memory and moonlight, and then they drove 3 miles down the mountain road in near darkness, watching the road and the trees on both sides, watching the mirrors. When they finally stopped in a wide gravel pullout near a Forest Service road junction, my mother started crying. Not from fear, she said, from the sudden deflation of the tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying in every muscle for those past few minutes. My father wrapped his arm around her. They sat in the truck cab listening to the forest around them be completely, utterly silent. After maybe 15 minutes, they got out carefully, checked the tree line in every direction, and set up their sleeping bags in the truck bed. My father found a battery radio at the bottom of the gear bag. A boxing match was on. He still claims it was Tyson, though the timeline is slightly murky. They cracked open 2 beers from the cooler. The announcer's voice through the crackly radio signal was the most comforting sound either of them had ever heard. They slept badly, in shifts, with the radio on all night. The second night, in daylight with blue sky above the pines and the creek, sound rising and falling in the distance, and a pair of Steller's jays having a loud territorial argument in the tree above the truck, the previous night seemed more manageable. Still strange. Still worth noting, but manageable. My parents did what most people would do. They constructed explanations. A hiker, a fellow camper taking a late walk, not realizing anyone else was there. Someone who lived in the area and used this spot regularly. The footsteps were probably louder in the dark, when everything is amplified. When your threat detection system is already elevated just from being outdoors at night. My mother is a practical person. She had completed a year of nursing school and had already developed the kind of professional instinct that reaches first for the most likely explanation and only escalates from there when the evidence demands it. They talked themselves back into the trip, both of them, together over coffee and scrambled eggs cooked on the camp stove in the morning light. This is something I've thought about many times since. They spent the day as they'd planned. They hiked 4 miles on the Ridge Trail, through old-growth timber so tall and dense that the light came down in long golden columns, and the ground was soft under their boots with decades of accumulated needles. They swam in the creek, which was exactly as cold and clear as advertised. Cold enough that my mother yelped when she first went under, and my father laughed and then yelped louder when he followed her in. She found a small flat smooth rock near the water's edge and carried it in her pocket for the rest of the afternoon because she liked the weight and the feel of it in her palm. She still has that rock. It sits on her kitchen windowsill. She never explained to anyone why she kept it, and she doesn't need to. They made dinner over the fire and watched the light on the ridge go through its evening progression. Gold, then pink, then the deep purpling slate blue of mountain dusk that is one of the most beautiful things on earth if you're in the right place to see it. It was everything the photos had promised, and then some. By the time they settled into the tent at 11 o'clock, it had been a genuinely good day. The kind of day that reminds you why you came, that pushes the previous night further back into the category of manageable, explicable, almost certainly nothing. My dad was asleep within 4 minutes. He sleeps the way only people who do sustained physical labor sleep, completely, almost instantaneously, as though sleep is something the body simply claims when it decides it's time, without negotiation or ceremony. My mother has always been different. She's a light sleeper by nature, a half-awake and listening sleeper, the kind of person whose nervous system apparently decided at some early point in her development that full unconsciousness was a luxury it could not consistently afford. She lay in the warm dark of the tent. She listened to her husband's breathing, slow and even beside her. She listened to the creek in the middle distance, its sound rising and falling slightly as the breeze shifted through the trees. She listened to the settling sounds of the forest at night, the small movements, the distant calls, the low hum and murmur of an ecosystem that never fully stops. She listened for footsteps. For about 20 minutes, she heard nothing. Then she heard them. They were closer this time, much, much closer. Not at the edge of the campsite, but directly outside the tent, moving slowly around the tent's perimeter, maybe 3 or 4 feet from the nylon wall. She could hear the specific compression of each footfall with complete, horrible clarity. The crunch of pine needles, the slight drag of each step, the deliberate, patient weight of each landing. Not hurried, not careful, simply patient. She reached over and grabbed my father's shoulder and shook it. He made a sound like he was surfacing from deep water and went still again. She shook harder. He rolled slightly. She put her mouth directly against his ear and hissed his name. He did not wake up. She was alone. She lay completely still and listened to the footsteps circle the tent. Once. Twice. They stopped directly at the tent door. The voice that came through the nylon was conversational. That's the detail she always comes back to. The detail that always sends the specific cold slip of real fear through my spine when she describes it. Not screaming, not whispering, not theatrical, conversational. The tone you'd use to tell someone the time, or pass along information they'd asked for, or comment on something neither of you could change. Here I am. I'm going to kill you. And then, while saying nothing more, the person drew something along the outside of the tent wall. She heard the sound of it, thin, sliding, deliberate, the nylon offering slight resistance, and she understood without conscious analysis exactly what she was hearing. Some knowledge is older than logic. Some knowledge your body holds without ever having been told. She could hear his feet on the ground just outside the door. She could see, in the faint moonlight pressing through the tent fabric, the shadow of his shoes at the base of the door zipper. She could hear the blade moving without hurry along the tent wall. She couldn't move. She described it to me, both times, in exactly the same terms. Not a panic attack, not a faint, not the dramatic paralysis of a horror movie. A shutdown. Her mouth was open. The scream was in her chest like something dense and cold that wouldn't come up. She was staring at the shadow of his shoes and she was simply not functioning. And then something unlocked. She's described it as the part of you that was human before language, the oldest machinery, the deepest reflex, the survival mechanism that runs on something far more ancient than conscious thought. It reached up through the shutdown and took back the controls. She pulled in a breath. "Derek, grab the rifle and shoot him. Now!" My father came out of sleep like a man electrocuted, upright, alert, already in motion. Outside, a sharp intake of breath. Then the sound of someone running, not walking, not retreating, but sprinting, crashing hard through underbrush, branches snapping under feet, suddenly moving as fast as they could carry their owner away from whatever was in that tent. My parents did not own a rifle. They had a camp knife in a gear bag at a campsite 3 miles up the mountain. The bluff had no basis in reality whatsoever. It worked completely. My father scrambled out of the tent and ran into the dark forest after the retreating sounds. He ran for 200 yards before the crashing faded and the forest went silent around him. He stood barefoot on the pine needles in the dark and breathed, and there was nothing. The person was gone. The tires they packed in the dark by the beam of a single flashlight, working quickly and without speaking much. They had already decided, without saying it explicitly, without even fully acknowledging what had just happened, that they were leaving. Immediately. Right now, in the dark, on mountain roads. They didn't care. My father walked ahead to the truck. My mother followed with the sleeping bags under her arms. He stopped. She walked around the truck to see what he was looking at. Both rear tires were completely flat, not slowly deflating. Flat, sunk down to the rim, the sidewalls bulging out against the gravel. She remembers kneeling down next to one of them and running her hand along the rubber in the dark until her fingertips found the cut. Long, clean, deliberate. Not a puncture from a nail or a rock. A cut. Someone had done this to the truck while they were in the tent, while the man was walking around the tent or before. They had no way of knowing how long the tires had been slashed before the footsteps started. The implications of this landed on my parents separately and arrived at the same destination. They had been here longer than we knew. They had been watching us before we knew they were there. We were parked here in the dark, miles from any other person, and we could not leave. My father tried to inflate the tires with the hand pump they carried for air mattresses. He pumped until his shoulders gave out. You cannot reinflate a slashed tire. The air goes in and comes straight back out through the cut. They locked themselves in the truck cab, turned off all lights, sat in the dark, and waited. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, my mother counted. Headlights came around the bend in the road. A Park Service truck pulled up alongside them. A ranger in his early 50s on a late patrol, surprised to find an occupied vehicle parked out here in the dark. He brought them to the ranger station in the town of Millbrook, where they were given terrible coffee and a space heater in a waiting room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner. And both of those things were so deeply, thoroughly wonderful that my mother cried again for the second time that night. The fluorescent light in the waiting room flickered slightly on the right side. A calendar on the wall showed a photo of Mount Hood. A poster described proper food storage procedures in bear country. My mother has said she remembers every single detail of that waiting room with perfect precision. And she thinks it's because her brain was in the state where it records everything, indiscriminately, with the clarity that comes after the body's emergency systems finally begin to stand down. While the ranger filled out an incident report, he told them something that made every recoverable warmth from the coffee and the space heater leave my mother's body all at once. He had been running an extended patrol on this stretch of mountain road, specifically because of a series of homicides that had occurred in the area over the previous 18 months. Campers, primarily. Couples and small groups who had come up to these backcountry spots and not come back. There was no suspect in custody. There was no clear pattern except the location and the victims' profiles. Young, from the city, unfamiliar with the area, camping alone or in pairs. The ranger told my parents that they had been parked approximately a half mile from the location where the most recent victims had been found, roughly 6 weeks earlier. He said it with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering hard information to people who needed to hear it, and he let the silence after it sit without trying to fill it. Then he looked at my mother for a long moment and said, "You were smart to leave when you did, and you were smart to make the noise you made." My parents got their tires replaced the next morning at a garage in Millbrook, run by a man who looked at the cuts in the sidewalls for a long time before he said anything. What he finally said was, "Those aren't road damage," and then he replaced both tires without charging them for labor, and wouldn't explain why when my dad tried to pay him the full amount. They drove back to Portland. Neither of them has been camping in a remote backcountry area since. My mother has never stopped being a light sleeper. She says she doesn't mind. She says she considers it a fair trade. The children on Heron Court. The babysitting years. This story belongs to a woman I'll call Renee. Renee is 27 years old. She lives in the mid-Atlantic region of the country. She asked me, when she submitted her account, not to specify the city or the state, and I'm honoring that. What she didn't ask me to protect was the story itself. She said, "I want people to know about these kids. I don't know why. I just do." When Renee was 13, she started babysitting. She was the kind of 13-year-old who got good grades not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she found learning genuinely interesting. She was responsible in the specific way that some kids are responsible. Not rule-following for its own sake, but genuinely attuned to consequences, to cause and effect, to what happens if you don't pay attention. She was also, by her own accounting, not particularly interested in the social architecture of 8th grade, which left her with time and inclination to build something more useful, a small babysitting business and a growing savings account. She charged $8 an hour, which was reasonable, and she built her client base through word of mouth. Parents recommended her to other parents. She had 4 or 5 regular families, kids she knew and liked, houses she was comfortable in. Most nights it was fine. Homework, SpaghettiOs, a movie. Bedtime negotiations she usually won through patience and consistency. She would go home at 11 with cash in her pocket and a straightforward sense of competent accomplishment. She spent most of that money, she admits, on music that she still owns and still feels slightly embarrassed about, but won't get rid of. In the fall of 2011, one of her regular clients referred her to a family on Heron Court, a quiet residential street in a suburb that, from the outside, was entirely unremarkable. 2 children, a 9-year-old girl named Lily and a 7-year-old boy named Max. The booking was for a Saturday night. The mother called to discuss the job in advance, which Renee appreciated. She was detailed, organized, the kind of person who had a system for everything and had thought through every contingency. She told Renee about dietary considerations. No artificial dyes, no peanuts. About bedtime routines. Bath first, then one story, then lights off. In that order, she emphasized, as though the order mattered in ways she didn't elaborate. About what the children were allowed to watch on television and what they weren't. She gave Renee her cell phone number and her husband's cell phone number and the number of a landline at the restaurant where they'd be having dinner, which no one who grew up after 2005 has ever actually needed, but which Renee found oddly reassuring. Also, in retrospect, slightly strange, as though the mother wanted Renee to know, precisely and specifically, where she could be reached, where she would be, how far away. On the night itself, the house was neat and very clean in the way that houses are when the people who live in them have decided that visible disorder is a kind of failure. No shoes anywhere, no dishes, no books left open, no half-finished drinks on coffee tables, no evidence of the small accumulating chaos of ordinary daily life. It felt staged, Renee thought, not for selling but for some audience she couldn't identify. The mother handed Renee a printed schedule. dinner at 7, baths at 8, stories or one episode of a pre-approved show from a list. Lights out at 9. The schedule also included, on a separate sticky note attached to the refrigerator, the food that Renee was welcome to help herself to. It was a specific, itemized list. The father shook her hand on his way out. The handshake lasted about 2 seconds longer than it should have, and his eyes didn't land anywhere in particular while he did it. Not on Renee. Not on his wife. Somewhere a middle distance, like he was thinking about something else entirely. He made a joke about dealing harshly with any boys who showed up, that delivered with a laugh that didn't quite match the words and landed in silence. Renee smiled politely. The door closed. The house went quiet. Lily from across the room started singing. Songs and glass. The song, if it was a song, had no melody and no identifiable structure. It was a phrase, repeated, in a register slightly higher than Lily's speaking voice, with a flatness of affect that took a moment to register as deliberate. We're all alone now. We're all alone now. We're all alone. Renee looked at her. Lily looked back. Still singing. Max, from the couch, said, "Let's play." Not the way children suggest activities. Informational. The way you'd say it's raining or the bus is late. Like something had already been decided and he was simply letting her know the terms. Renee suggested a movie. Lily stopped singing and smiled. The smile arrived fully formed without the usual gradual process of a real smile, and it didn't reach her eyes. "Sure," she said. The next 45 minutes were an education in a very specific kind of deliberate chaos. The kids pushed every rule Renee established, not with tantrums but with a kind of patient, exploratory testing, like they were cataloging the edges of what she would and wouldn't enforce, mapping her reactions. When Renee said no to the show they wanted, it was rated for significantly older audiences and the parents had clearly not approved it. Lily didn't argue. She simply proposed that she and Max go play in the family room instead, with a particular emphasis on instead that Renee recognized as a separation tactic. She kept them in the living room. Lily's smile went slightly more fixed. Around 7 o'clock, Renee went to the kitchen to make dinner. Sandwiches. Simple. Exactly what the parents had specified. She's a vegetarian, so she set the kids' sandwiches up first and then started making herself a small salad from the vegetables in the refrigerator. She had been in the kitchen for approximately 90 seconds when she heard the crash. She went back to the living room. Lily was standing near the coffee table with an expression working very hard to approximate guilt and landing somewhere in the vicinity of composed neutrality. A glass was broken on the hardwood floor, spread in a scatter pattern, suggesting it had fallen from the table rather than being thrown. Renee sighed. She found the broom. She swept up every visible piece of glass, including the smaller fragments that had skittered under the edge of the couch. She put everything into the trash can in the kitchen, pushed it down into the bag, made sure it was covered. She washed her hands. She went back to making the salad. She noticed, peripherally, that both children watched her dispose of the glass with the kind of attention that people usually reserve for things that matter. She put it in her mental file labeled, "These kids are weird," and kept making dinner. The performance. She was finishing the sandwiches when Max screamed. It was a large, theatrical sound, the kind of scream that bypasses analysis and activates the caretaker response directly. And Renee dropped what she was doing and moved quickly into the living room. Max was on the couch, one hand clutched around his ankle, his face arranged in the portrait of agony that only children under 10 can fully commit to. He looked up at Renee with eyes that were working very hard to be wet. "My ankle," he said with great sorrow. "I think I really hurt it." Renee knelt down. She asked him what happened. He looked at the ceiling. He said he wasn't sure. She asked him to point to where it hurt. He pointed. She examined the ankle carefully. No swelling, no bruising, no warmth. Full range of motion when she gently rotated it. She asked him if it hurt when she pressed here. He said yes. She pressed somewhere else. He said yes to that too. She was focused entirely on Max. Out of the corner of her left eye, she registered Lily leaving the doorway and moving toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen. She noted it. She didn't act on it. She was managing an injury, or the performance of an injury. And Lily was just going back to the kitchen, and Renee was 13 and doing her best and couldn't be in two places at once. After about 2 minutes, Max's eyes slid quickly to a point just over Renee's shoulder. The pain in his face vanished like a switch had been thrown. "Oh," he said, sitting up. "It's actually fine now. It stopped hurting." Renee turned around. Lily was standing in the doorway. She was very still. She was wearing the smile that had arrived fully formed earlier, and it was the same smile, identical, reproduced precisely. And Renee felt, for the first time, the specific low-frequency wrongness of these two children that she'd been cataloging all evening without fully naming. The salad Renee set the sandwiches out at the dining table. Lily's plate, Max's plate, her salad bowl in front of her own seat. She went back to the kitchen to get 3 glasses of water. She was gone for, she estimates, 45 seconds. When she came back, both children were seated at the table, hands in their laps, looking at her. Not at their food, at her. She sat down. She picked up her fork. "Aren't you guys gonna eat?" she asked. They looked at each other. A brief, wordless exchange of something she couldn't read. Then Lily said, "We were waiting for you to start first." Renee has described this moment as a physical sensation, a dropping feeling in her chest, she said, like the floor went down an inch very quickly. She couldn't have explained it in language at the time. She was 13. She didn't have the vocabulary for what her body was telling her, but she had the instinct. She looked at her salad. She lifted the top layer. Underneath the first few leaves of romaine, mixed carefully and thoroughly throughout the salad below, were pieces of broken glass. Not just 1 or 2 fragments, pieces distributed evenly through the whole bowl, large enough to cut deep, small enough to be invisible under the greens until you looked for them. She stared at it for a long moment while her brain caught up with her eyes. The glass from the floor. The glass she had swept up and put in the trash. The glass that Lily had gone back for while Max held Renee's attention with a fake injury. They had planned this. From the moment the glass broke, possibly before, possibly the glass had been broken deliberately to set up the sequence, they had run a complete operation. Distract. Access. Plant. Wait. Renee stood up. Her chair scraped back hard against the floor. She turned to them and the words came out louder than she intended, higher than she intended, cracking slightly at the edges. She told them what they had done. She told them they could have sent her to the hospital. She told them she didn't understand what was wrong with them. She told them she was going to call their parents. And those 2 children, a 9-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy, children who by any measure should have reacted with fear or shame, or at the very least a defensive pretense of innocence, looked at each other across the table and laughed. Renee has tried in multiple retellings to describe this laugh accurately. She always arrives at the same description: wrong. Not the laugh of children who found something funny. Not the silly, helpless laugh of kids who'd been caught doing something naughty. It was low and even, and entirely without the breathlessness that genuine laughter produces. It was, she said, the laugh of adults who were very pleased with themselves. She locked herself in the downstairs bathroom. She called her older sister. She explained what had happened in a rapid, barely coherent whisper. Her sister drove over within 20 minutes, and the two of them sat on the front steps in the October cold and waited for the parents to come home. Renee told the parents there had been an accident with a glass and that she wasn't going to be available for future bookings. She gave no details. She went home. She said to me, "What I think about, even now, is the planning. The specific, detailed, patient planning. They saw the opportunity when the glass broke, and they built a whole strategy around it. The fake injury, the timing, the way Max held my eyes at the exact right moment. That's not kids being impulsive or weird or testing limits. That's something that takes a particular kind of mind. They were 7 and 9, and they were genuinely disappointed that it didn't work. Not scared, not embarrassed, disappointed. And then they laughed. I have worked with children for years since then. I coached youth volleyball for 3 seasons. I have nephews and nieces and the kids of a dozen close friends. In all of those years and all of those children, I have never encountered anyone like Lily and Max. I don't know what they grew up to be. I genuinely hope I never find out. What they found in Tommy's cabin, 5 guys, 1 truck, 1 bad decision. Marcus is 28 years old and teaches physical education at a high school in the Northeast. He has a fantasy football league. He coaches a recreational soccer team on weekends. He has a golden retriever named Clyde who, he tells me, is a genuinely excellent dog in every way that a dog can be excellent. He is, by any observable measure, a normal person living a normal life in a normal American city. He also has, somewhere in the interior architecture of his memory, a room that he keeps locked. He can tell when the door to that room is open because certain things become difficult. Driving on rural roads after dark, basements in unfamiliar houses, the smell of damp concrete. He manages it. He's learned the triggers and routes around them, but the room is always there. In the spring 3 years ago, Marcus and 4 of his closest friends were 25 years old and badly in need of a vacation. His friend Tommy, they'd been friends since junior year of high school. The kind of friends who have been to each other's worst moments and come out the other side, had mentioned more than once a property his grandparents had owned in central Vermont. 20-something acres of second-growth forest, a small cabin from the 60s, a creek with brown trout, enough flat ground for paintball and off-road vehicles. Tommy's grandparents had left it to him when they passed, and he hadn't sold it because the idea of selling something his grandfather had built with his own hands was something he wasn't ready to sit with yet. Well, hadn't been up there in just over a year. The power was off. The cabin was closed for winter. But it was April. The roads were clear, and 5 young men who had been living in cities for 4 years decided collectively that what they needed was dirt roads and no cell service, and the specific freedom of being somewhere that nobody knew where you were. They left from a suburb of Boston on a Saturday afternoon. Perfect spring weather, mid-60s light breeze, the trees along the highway just beginning to go green at the tips in the tentative way they do in New England in April, as though they're not entirely sure the cold is done with them yet. They stopped twice on the highway, once more for gas and road food, at the Vermont border, and made the kind of disorganized, sprawling conversation that only happens on long drives with people you've known for years. The kind of conversation that loops back on itself, that involves a lot of inside references, that occasionally devolves into the recitation of old stories everyone already knows. But that somehow improved in the retelling. Marcus said it was one of the best drives he'd ever taken. He said it specifically in those terms, which he now recognizes as one of those gifts that memory sometimes gives you, preserving the last ordinary hour before everything changed. It was approaching 7:30 in the evening when they finally turned off the paved road and onto the gravel drive that ran through the trees toward Tommy's cabin. The light was going in the specific way it goes in Vermont hills in early April, still in the sky, still orange gold at the horizon. But the forest floor already dark, already doing its evening thing. The gravel under the tires made a sound that Marcus said always makes him think of arriving somewhere. The particular crunch of gravel that means you've left the road and you're somewhere specific now. A place with a name and a history. A place that someone built. The trees closed in on both sides of the drive. They came around the last bend before the clearing. Tommy hit the brakes. The open door. The front door of the cabin was open. Not cracked. Not ajar. Open. Standing fully open, the darkness of the cabin interior showing in the gap. The door itself hanging still in the windless evening air. And through the front windows of the cabin, clearly visible in the early dusk, a flashlight beam was moving around inside. Nobody said anything for a moment. The engine idled. Marcus said he became aware of his own heartbeat in a way that was sudden and very specific. Not racing, just suddenly audible, suddenly present, like a sound that had been there all along and he was only now noticing it. He was the first one to speak. "We need to go. Right now. Back to the road." He said it calmly and clearly, and he meant it entirely. His body, his gut, his everything was telling him that the correct action was to put this vehicle in reverse and leave. Tommy looked at him. Then Tommy looked at the cabin. Then Tommy pressed on the gas, drove up to within 30 feet of the porch, and held the horn down for a solid 10 seconds. The sound of it, that long, sustained blast through the quiet forest evening, was enormous. It bounced back off the trees. Birds erupted from the canopy somewhere to the left. Inside the cabin, the flashlight went dark. The windows went black. The door hung open. Tommy parked, got out, walked toward the porch with his flashlight in his hand, and absolutely no other plan. "Marcus told me. I want to be clear that I was afraid. I want to be clear that I knew something was wrong. But I also want to be clear about what you do when you've been friends with someone for 9 years, and they're walking towards something dangerous and alone. You follow them, not because you're not afraid, because you are, and you go anyway." They all followed Tommy into the cabin. The search. The electricity wasn't on. Tommy had planned to call the power company ahead of the trip and had forgotten, so they navigated by phone flashlights. Those thin beams that illuminate just enough to make the darkness beyond them feel denser. The cabin had the specific smell of long-closed spaces, dust, old wood, the ghost of wood smoke from the fireplace, something damp and coal underneath everything else. Tommy and a friend, Marcus, calls Devlin, took the stairs to the basement. Marcus and the other two, Caleb and Jordan, split up to cover the main floor. Caleb went to the kitchen. Jordan took the small bedroom and bathroom. Marcus moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom at the back of the cabin. He stood at the end of the hallway, his phone light pointed at the floor. In front of him was a sliding closet door, the bifold kind, with a small round wooden pull. The room was still. The only sounds were his breathing and the faint footsteps of Caleb moving around the kitchen. He reached out his hand toward the closet door pull. From below, from the basement, Tommy and Devlin both screamed. The sound was immediate and involuntary, not performed fear, not surprise, but the specific raw sound of people confronting something they were not equipped to confront. Marcus turned toward the hallway. The closet opened. A man came out fast, burst out, uncoiling from whatever position he'd been holding in the dark, and had Marcus around the chest and both arms pinned. Before Marcus had processed that the closet had opened, he yelled. Caleb and Jordan came from the front of the cabin at a run. They grabbed the man by his shirt, his arms, whatever they could reach, and pulled him off Marcus, and the man wrenched free and ran, directly through the cabin's main room and out the open front door and into the forest beyond, running hard, not looking back. Marcus stood in the hallway breathing. He checked that his arms still worked. From the basement, Tommy's voice came up the stairs. Low, wrong, not urgent. Something past urgent. Come down here. The basement. The smell reached Marcus before the bottom step. He's described it multiple times and always arrives at the same two words: copper and rot. The specific pairing, the specific combination of those two things that your body understands before your mind catches up. There are not many smells in the world that register that way. That one does. The basement was unfinished. Concrete walls, concrete floor, bare bulb in the ceiling that wasn't on, exposed pipe and insulation. Tommy was standing against the far wall with his flashlight beam pointed down, and Devlin was next to him with one hand over his mouth, and neither of them was moving. On the floor in front of them, in the circle of the flashlight beam, were two bodies. Marcus will not describe them in detail. I have asked him across several exchanges, and he has declined consistently, and I respect that completely. What he has told me, they were not people who had died recently and cleanly. The blood on the concrete floor had dried dark and spread wide, and there was more of it than he had been prepared to understand. The injuries, he has said only they weren't intact, were of a kind that indicated prolonged and deliberate violence. They ran, all five of them, up the stairs and out the front door and into the driveway, gasping in the cold April air, and no one said anything for a long moment. The man from the closet was gone. The forest beyond the clearing was dark and still. Tommy called 911. The Vernon County Sheriff's Department arrived in 18 minutes, and then more units, and then state police, and the cabin's driveway turned into something unrecognizable. Red and blue light sweeping through the pines, yellow tape, officers in gloves moving with equipment cases, voices on radios. The county medical examiner's van arrived at 11. The five of them sat in the back of a patrol car for 2 hours and gave their statements. An officer brought them coffee in small paper cups at some point. Nobody drank it. The victims were identified as two men in their early 30s, residents of a town in another county. No obvious connection to Tommy, or to the property, or to Tommy's grandparents, or to anyone Marcus or his friends could identify. No clear motive that was ever explained to them. As of the last follow-up call Marcus received from the investigator assigned to the case, approximately 8 weeks after the incident, there was no suspect in custody and no arrest imminent. The investigator was careful and professional and gave Marcus exactly as much information as he was authorized to share, which was not much. The man from the closet, the man who had been hiding in that cabin with two bodies in the basement, who had held Marcus around the chest in the dark hallway before running, was never identified. He went into the forest and he did not come out of it. Not on that night, not in any subsequent investigation, not in any of the communications Marcus received in the months that followed. He was simply, completely, finally gone. The forest received him and kept him. Marcus and his friends drove back to Boston in a silence that none of them tried to fill. He said they didn't speak about it as a group for nearly 2 weeks after. When they did finally talk, it was brief and careful and oblique. The kind of conversation that circles the event without landing on it, that acknowledges this happened without attempting to analyze what it means, because some things are not improved by analysis. He told me in one of his later messages, "I function fine. I want to be clear about that. I go to work. I coach the soccer team. I watch football on Sundays. Clyde still requires 2 walks a day and is very serious about this, which is probably good for me. I have a normal life and I'm grateful for it, but I want to tell you the part that stays. I think people expect the worst part to be the bodies. And yes, that's there. That's always there. I'll be driving somewhere at dusk and something about the light or the way the trees look will pull it up and I'll be back in that basement for a few seconds. That's real and it doesn't fully go away. I've learned to let it pass. But what I think about most is the man in the closet. He was in that cabin with those bodies. He'd been there for, we don't know how long. Hours, certainly. Possibly longer. Days, maybe. In a closed cabin with no lights and 2 dead men in the basement. And when he ran, he didn't head for the road. He didn't head for any light or any direction that made sense for someone disoriented or lost or frightened. He ran straight into the forest, without hesitation, without looking back, without slowing, like he knew exactly where he was going, like the forest wasn't somewhere he was running to, like it was somewhere he was running back to. I think about that. On dark roads, when the trees are close on both sides, when I'm somewhere without many people around, I think about the fact that he's still out there, wherever out there is. I think about the fact that we never saw his face clearly. I think about the fact that the forest is very large. I don't go to remote places anymore. I don't think I ever will again. 3 stories. 3 ordinary days that went somewhere else entirely. What they have in common is not the specific horror of each one. The stalker in the pines, the children with the glass, the man from the closet. What they have in common is a moment in each story where the body knew before the mind did. My mother heard footsteps and felt something shift inside her before she'd consciously decided to be afraid. Renee looked at her salad before she took a bite, driven by a feeling she couldn't have named with language but trusted anyway. Marcus wanted to back down that driveway the moment he saw the open door. And a part of him, the part that was right, never stopped wanting that. Your instincts are not irrational. They are not paranoia. They are not the overactive anxiety of a mind that watches too much news or listens to too many podcasts. They are the accumulated pattern recognition of a species that spent the vast majority of its existence, not the last few thousand years of cities and laws and emergency services, but the vast majority, the hundreds of thousands of years before all of that, trying to survive in exactly these kinds of situations. Darkness, isolation, sounds that don't fit, behavior that's slightly wrong, movement at the edge of visibility, something that looks fine but doesn't feel fine. That machinery still works. It's been refined over more generations than you can count. It runs below the surface of conscious thought, processing thousands of inputs simultaneously. And when it reaches a conclusion, it delivers that conclusion to you as a feeling, a drop in the chest, a tightening between the shoulder blades, a voice that says something is wrong here before you've consciously identified what. The question is whether you listen to it. My mother listened. She is 70 years old and in excellent health, and she calls me on Sunday mornings and we talk for too long, and I am grateful for every second of it. Renee looked at her salad before she took a bite. She is 27 years old and teaching herself to cook, and has a cat she describes as deeply emotionally complicated, and she is here to tell me these things. Marcus wanted to turn the car around. He didn't, and he carries what he found in that basement in a locked room inside himself, and he will carry it for the rest of his life. But he is here, he survived. His instincts ultimately did not fail him. They failed to stop him from going in, but they kept him alert and reactive enough to survive what came out of the closet. 3 people, 3 ordinary American nights, 3 moments where the body knew before the mind did. Now, I've thought about what connects these stories beyond the obvious, beyond the fear, the darkness, the physical danger. What I keep coming back to is the specific quality of wrongness in each one. Not loud wrongness, not obvious wrongness, the quiet kind. The footsteps that were slightly too deliberate, the children's laughter that was slightly too low, the open door that should have been locked, the wrongness that announces itself not as a scream, but as a note slightly off key, something small enough to rationalize away, large enough that your body won't let you. Every one of these people had the option to dismiss what they were sensing, and some of them, for a time, did. My parents told themselves it was a hiker. Marcus tried to tell himself, that there were probably a dozen explanations. Renee filed those children's behavior under weird, but probably fine for 45 minutes before. The glass in her salad made it impossible to continue. The stories we tell ourselves to make things normal are powerful. They're comfortable. They let us keep going, keep camping, keep babysitting, keep driving down gravel roads toward places we've been told are safe. Sometimes those stories are true and the uncomfortable feeling was nothing. Sometimes they're not. There is something in the dark spaces of this country, in the mountains and the deep forests and the backcountry campgrounds and the remote cabins and the houses on quiet streets where the neighbors don't know each other. It has always been there. It is not supernatural. It is not a monster from a movie. It is something much more specific and much more difficult to defend against. It is the capacity of human beings, under certain conditions, to become something that does not operate by the rules that most of us have agreed, mostly unconsciously, to live by. Your only job is to pay attention to the signal when it comes. You don't have to be paranoid. You don't have to be afraid of every dark road or empty parking lot or unfamiliar house. But when the note sounds off-key, when the footsteps are slightly too deliberate, when the children's laughter is slightly too low, when the door is open when it should be closed, let yourself hear it. Don't reach for the explanation before you've heard the signal. My mother has never stopped being a light sleeper. She considers it a fair trade. Share this story with someone you want to keep safe, not to frighten them, but because people who've heard these accounts tend to remember them in the moments when remembering might matter. And if you have your own story, something that happened in the dark, something you couldn't explain, something you've never told anyone because you weren't sure you'd be believed, tell us in the comments. We're here. We're listening. The most dangerous things in this world look, until the very last moment, completely ordinary. Until they don't. Sleep well tonight, or don't.